Hello everyone, this is Alex Ipatov, and this is the video number 12 of the series on Rook Endgames. In this video I'm going to talk about the principle number 1 in Rook Endgames, the principle of two weaknesses. So what do we see in this position? First of all, white has the active rook and black has passive rook. Why it's so? Well, the white rook attacks the c6 pawn and the opponent's rook protects the c6 pawn. Also, if we play rook a5, we will force the black rook to go to a8, and once again we will be attacking and black will be defending. So this is first, but as we see, it's not enough, because when we play rook a5, black plays rook a8. When we go back to c5, the black rook goes back to c8. So we see that weaknesses on queen side are not enough, because the black king will come to d6, protecting the c6 pawn, and the rook will protect the a6 pawn. Therefore, white needs to create the second weakness, the weakness on the king side. Somewhere there. We don't know which one exactly. So in the game, white played king e2. So we can see that another principle in action, this king centralization, is another important principle in any sort of endgame, not only rook endgames. So white is bringing his king to d4, to a perfect central square, in order to support the rook on c5, and to facilitate the e4 move. King e7, king d3, king d6, rook a5. White switches attack to a6. Now black is forced to go to a8, so once again we see that our rook is active and the black rook is passive. We play king d4. Before we create the second weakness on the king side, first we have to fix the weaknesses on the queen side. So first we need to fix these weaknesses, a6 and c6. We can do it by playing b4 and then a3, and the pawn on b4 will be limiting the further activity of the black's a and c pawns. Okay, so black played f5, white played b4. As I already said, the idea of this move is to fix the weaknesses. Okay, in the game black played rook b8. The better chance would be in king c7, with the idea to bring the king to b7, from where it would be able to protect both pawns and liberate the rook and make it active. So king c7 would be a better move. Something like this could have happened, king c5, king b7, king d6 and rook e8, with good chances to make a draw, because now the black rook is not passive anymore. But in the game black played rook b8 after b4, which gave white 2 extra tempi, so white supported the b4 by playing a3. Now the a6 pawn is hanging, so the rook went back to a8. So during the last few moves, white has significantly improved his position. The king is centralized. The pawn on b4 limits the activity of black's two weaknesses, the a6 and c6 pawns. But as we see, it's not enough, because all the weaknesses are being protected by the black king and the black rook. And also, black wants to play king c7, king b7, and then liberate the rook on the e file. So that's why white plays e4 and opens up the center. The idea of this move is to create the second weakness on the king side. But first we need to extend the field. So we play e4, we exchange some pawns, and now we have cleared the way towards the other weakness. This is going to be the pawn h7. As I have shown with the arrows, white wants to play king f4, king g5, king h6, attacking the h7 pawn. In the game, black missed one more opportunity to activate his rook. This could have been achieved by playing king c7. The idea is the same, to bring the king to b6 or b7, from where it can defend both pawns. So something like this could have happened, h4, king b6, g4, rook f8, h5, and so on. White, of course, is still better, but the black rook is more active than before. But in the game, black neglected this factor. Black preferred to stay passive, rook a7. So white played king e4. The idea of this move is to go to h6, then push the pawns g4, h4, h5, and open the way for the rook. For example, if black stays passive, white can come closer. e6, maybe h4 is possible. King d6, g4, e6. Now maybe white can play something like this. Take, then g5, this, king h6, and so on. And then bring the rook to f8, to h8, to win the pawn. But this did not happen in the game. Black played h6, enabling the white king from going to g5. So now white played h4 with the idea play king g4, h5, king e6, king g4, rook e8, and now h5. The idea of this move is to fix another weakness. The first weaknesses are a6 and c6. They're quite close to each other, so just two of them is not enough. So that's why white creates the other weakness, now the pawn on h6. So by playing h5, we fix the weakness. So remember, before we attack something, we need to fix it. So this is exactly what white is doing in this position. If black plays g takes h5, then simply king takes h5, rook g8 and g4. This is hanging, and as we see, black cannot hold both weaknesses at a time. Black can either play rook a8, protecting the a6 pawn, but then king h6 wins. Either playing rook h8, protecting the h6 pawn, but then white wins by taking on a6. So this variation perfectly illustrates the strengths of two weaknesses, why it's important to create two weaknesses on different sides of the board. Anyways, in the game, black did not play g takes h5, black went for g5. But it didn't change much, because still the h6 is already a fixed weakness. So after creating the weakness, the white king has done its job on the king side. So white improves his position by maximum on the king side and then brings the king back to the center. So g3, taking the f4 square from the black rook. Just in case, for example, if we play king f3, maybe black could have checked this and rook f4 check. So that is the idea behind move g3. Prophylaxis. Black played rook a7. So white continues with his plan. White brings the king back to the center. Rook e8, king e4, rook a7, king d4, king d6. Okay, white repeated the position, and now rook e5 check comes. So now the rook wants to combine threats against a6, c6, and h6 pawns. There are too many weaknesses, and we will see black cannot hold all of them simultaneously. For example, if black plays king f6, trying to protect the h6 pawn, then white plays rook c5, so the king already cannot protect the c6 pawn because it's too far away. Then rook c7 is forced, then rook a5, attacking one more weakness. So rook a7 is forced, and now white invades via c5 square and further to b6. So this is what could have happened if black decided to protect the h6 pawn by playing king f6. Now let's take a look what happens if black plays king d6 with the idea to protect the queenside pawns. If black plays king d6, then white switches to the attack of h6 pawn. White plays rook e8 with the threat rook h8, rook takes h6. It's important to know that the pawn endgame is lost for black, so black cannot play rook e7 check because take king e5, and white wins because of the more active king and extra pawn moves at his disposal. So white has extra move g4, a4, a5, and so on. So whenever the black king moves, we go in the opposite direction. For example, we can play still king f5, and if king goes to e7, we go to g6, and we win the h6 pawn. If the king goes to g7, we go to e6, and we win the c pawn. So the pawn endgame is lost, so rook e7 is not possible. So in the game, black played c5, but then rook d8 took place. In case of king c7, then black would not be able to protect the h6 pawn. Let me show the illustrative variation. C takes b4, rook a7 check, king b8, rook takes a7, king a7, x takes b4, king b6, and white wins the pawn endgame. White is one tempo ahead. Take, a5, take, a4, h6, and so on. a3, h7, a2, and white wins. The a1 square is covered by the queen. So that's why in the game black did not play king c7, because rook h8 with a double threat, rook takes h6 and rook h7 check, threatening the rook straight. So black played king c6, but then white won the c5 pawn. King b6, rook takes c5. White is an extra pawn, and black still has two weaknesses, the pawn a6 and pawn h6. White's plan is pretty easy, just come with the king to g6 and attack the h6 pawn. Rook h7 happened, rook e5, king c6 check, king b5. We see that even before the end, white attacks both weaknesses, and black cannot do anything. King f5, rook f7, rook f6, and black resigned in this position. If rook h7, then simply king g6, rook h8, king g7, and black cannot hold the h6 pawn. So what we learned from this game, we learned that usually the weaknesses on one side are not enough because the opponent can protect them with ease. So in order to win the game, we have to extend the field and create the weakness on the other side of the board. In this case, black's weaknesses on a6 and c6 were not enough, so white created the other weakness on the king side, the h6 pawn. That was the video about two weaknesses, the principle number 1, and thank you for watching. It was Alex Ipatov.